I'm Melina Tsapos, and this is In-Depth Conversations. So for this episode of In-Depth Conversations, I'm very excited to have Assistant Professor Michael Bossetta as our guest. You're in the Department of Communications and Media Studies here at Lund University. Welcome to In-Depth Conversations, Michael.
Thanks so much. Thanks for tuning in.
You specialize in the impact of social media and politics. And you have also won recently the Grand Prix, the Forska Grand Prix, last year's 2021, which is a Swedish competition challenging researchers to present their research in the most competitive, inspiring, and educational way in just under 4 minutes. So you're with that, you've really shown your great skill in communicating your research. And so I want to get into a bit in our conversation about why that's important to do that, to be an effective communicator as a researcher. But before we get into all the good stuff, do you mind just telling us a little bit more about yourself and how you got into academia and why media and communication studies?
Yeah, it's a good question. I didn't, well, I guess we'll start with academia in general.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
I definitely didn't know what I was getting myself into in terms of like what it takes and all the different things you have to do. But I guess in school, you're given all these papers and you're supposed to read and compare these two arguments and contrast them. And I was always thinking like, why am I reading other people's stuff? What about what I think? I want to get into this debate. And so that was sort of the inspiration for me to get into academia. And then media and communication is nothing that I really studied in bachelor's or master's or anything. But I think any social scientist will tell you this. If you're a political scientist, you say everything is political. If you're a sociologist, everything is about sociology. I think communication, everything is communication, right? That's how we sort of have societies and get things done. And so with digital technologies, it's really sort of amplified that and changed sort of how we communicate. And sort of growing up with social media, like being a sort of early adopter of Facebook in high school and then sort of seeing how it's changed over time, was just sort of something that I was interested in studying. Interesting.
Do you see it as a parallel to like the marketplace was before, or is it like a totally new phenomena? Do you feel like it's changed society in a different fundamental way?
That's what we're researching,
yeah,
right?
Okay,
but it's one of these questions where like many things are not so different just because it's social media and they have cool new features like stories or whatever, AR lenses on Snapchat. You can often find that history sort of repeats itself in terms of radio being a revolution and television being a revolution and the internet and social media. And so one of the things we try to do is find parallels between what's actually different with social media. And sometimes actually it's not that different from television. People thought that television would be the downfall of society because people would do nothing. They would just sit on their couch and watch TV. And even though you see people on their phones all the time at the bus stop and it looks like that, I mean, we've had these concerns about disinformation with new media, with radio, with television. So
there are parallels,
definitely,
for sure. Okay.
Definitely. And there are also some new things as well.
Okay, we're going to get into it. Really interesting. But before we do all that, let's talk about just being able to communicate your research. Like I said, you won this Grand Prix prize, and you also have your podcast. I think we can put the link in the description below to it, because it's super cool, and it's called Social Media and Politics. So you discuss
very original.
Well, it's the name says what it's about, at least. And it's very popular, at least. It's been downloaded in over 150 different countries. And so it seems like it's very important for you to be able to communicate your research. Why should academics engage with the larger public and try to communicate their research?
Well, there's one aspect of it which is, I think, studying communication. In a sense, you have to sort of put it into practice, right? Like a communication researcher should be able to communicate. So that's more of a personal thing for me. But I mean, just getting to the basic sort of core of communication, if you can't communicate something, you can't get your information across. And so one of the things that academics really struggle with is taking specialized niche topics and being able to actually say what they are and why they matter.
Yeah.
And as an academic, you really need to hone that skill for different target groups, right? You can't take everything from an experiment in particle physics and communicate that to a policymaker. they're not going to understand. And we see that now with politicians trying to regulate tech platforms. They're not experts on the internet, right? And so you have to actually communicate your message and boil it down to that group versus the public, versus your other academics, versus your students. And so it's sort of, you have to switch between these different roles and different levels of complexity if you want to be understood.
That's so interesting that researchers, even if their aim is to know the truth, if they can't communicate it correctly, is I think what you're saying, then perhaps all this knowledge would get lost, right? You wouldn't be able to implement it in policy making and so on and so forth, right?
Exactly. If you only have 7 minutes to communicate your message to policymakers, for example, you have to boil down your message. Some of the complexity gets lost. And sometimes you have to phrase things differently so that you make sure that the one or maybe two things you want to communicate really lands. Otherwise, you just end up, and you can see this when you're teaching students, their faces are blank because you've lost them, right? You have to keep them engaged. And you do that by sort of tailoring your message to that audience. And I mean, that's sort of a fundamental aspect of communication. Any sort of public speaker will tell you that, right? Don't lose your audience. Think of them before and tailor your message to them.
Very keynotes, I think, for academics to be aware of. But do you see any tension here between, because you also study politics, right? And the emotions of how social media plays on emotions that between politics. Do you see any tension there between like promoting or more popular things to research and actual good things to research, like maybe more important research questions, or are they the same thing? Is there any dangers there? Or
well, I mean, I think a lot of this relates to your sort of identity as a scholar. What do you want to be? Do you want to be someone who searches for ground truth? And I know you're in a philosophy department, so we can talk about truth, but I mean, I think there's different, what is truth? Right. You have a conception of truth. A natural scientist has a conception of what is ground truth. I'm not sure that ground truth exists in social science. Like, I don't think that we'll find these magic bullets of how people will always respond to a certain treatment or a certain stimulus. It's going to vary, and it's going to vary over time and based on context. And so we're really sort of studying moving targets, especially when it comes to social media. The Facebook of today is not the Facebook of yesterday. There's updates that are happening all the time. So it's really hard to nail down this idea of ground truth. And we sort of have to keep checking the pulse on a rolling basis. Now, when it comes to the importance of the research question, maybe to you versus to society versus to the one that's going to get to ground truth, again, I think it relates to your identity, which is, what is your personal motivation in being a researcher? Some researchers feel that they should use research as a form of activism. Some think that they should be completely objective and impartial. Some view it more as, exactly as you said, to study the things that are most pressing for society. But maybe the things that are most pressing for society now are not what's most pressing in the future. So I think it relates to academic freedom. Like, you should have some freedom to study what you think is important for you as a scholar. Otherwise, you lose motivation. And we do know, maybe it's not a ground truth, but we do know there's a high correlation between intrinsic motivation, what you want to study, and actually carrying out that study, because you care about it. Same thing with learning or anything else. Any type sort of thought work or using your brain, you need to be motivated. And if you're being told, no, don't research what you want, research what we think is important, it's not going to be good research if you're not interested in that.
That's a key question. Let's continue with that for a bit, right? Academic freedom. Do you want to just quickly explain how you understand academic freedom? What is academic freedom?
Maybe I don't have what is the sort of common understanding or something. But I mean, one of the key, like, this job is a lot of work. I don't think people realize that. We have this idea of professors like lounging around and reading. It's not how it goes most of the time anyways. But academic freedom is the idea that you shouldn't be constrained in the topics that you're researching or necessarily how you're researching them, with the exception of harming people or breaking sort of ethical guidelines that we sort of establish, or breaking the law, obviously. Because the idea is that you should be sort of free and creative to explore new knowledge, because sometimes what the media is saying is super important may not be actually what we need to know as a society for the long term. So academic freedom is the idea that you should be unconstrained in your research to an extent, to explore topics that you think are valuable, right? Like, you do, there's a limit there, right? You don't want to just explore anything that's has no relevance whatsoever. But a lot of times the biggest breakthroughs are ones that didn't have immediate connection to, the day or prior research. Right?
Yeah, I think you nailed it down exactly. Like the important things with the academic freedom, and I think why academics really think it's an important principle. But more than that, it's not long ago in Sweden, it was in the summer of 2021, so only a year and a half ago, that it became sort of established in law, written in law in Sweden. And so do you think that we live in times where it becomes more important to emphasize this principle, or is it under threat somehow in Sweden? Why have we...
I definitely think it's under threat globally.
Okay.
And actually in Sweden, I think less so. That's one of the reasons that I'm here, right? Because you don't have, I come from the United States where there's so much tension around, everything from race to pronouns, gender, all this stuff. And you really have to be careful about what you're researching and how you present it, how you communicate it. And a lot of that is positive. A lot of that is sort of overcoming systemic biases and things like that. But I do think there is an element where when you're talking about sensitive issues like race and gender, it's very hard to have an open dialogue about them and sort of poke at critiques and counter arguments because you can be labeled, you can be misinterpreted. Going back to communication being important, right? This whole idea around cancel culture, right? So you have to be very careful in how you're writing in your academic texts, what you're researching and how you're discussing it. Are you using Latin X, which is sort of promoted in academia, but not by Hispanics themselves? Do you say Hispanic? Do you say Latino? Do you say Latina? Right? You're sort of offending everyone everywhere you go. So I think when you're dealing with social issues, there's going to be gender and race involved. And so those topics, which are very important to research and are sort of always a key part of the context, those, to me, seem to put a limit on academic freedom in the sense that not so much maybe in the research, but in the sort of discussions at conferences and between academics themselves. It can get very, very sort of hot and you don't want to sort of offend your colleagues because that spills over into how they use your research and things like that.
Okay, so you answered my next question actually, I think. So is it more so that we cancel ourselves in fear of getting canceled of our colleagues, or is it that our colleagues are canceling us, or how does it work? How does it manifest itself?
There's a risk of both.
Okay.
There's a risk of both. I was at a conference recently where one said, a colleague said, the project was about looking at some correlation between race and in the United States, and a colleague from Europe said, is it race or is it also class? And that person was shamed publicly on Twitter with the conference hashtag and everything. That being like, you don't understand, you're not in the US, you don't race is everything. And yes, maybe, but just the thought of what about an alternative explanation becomes sort of challenging something. And so everyone in that room is like taking note. I don't want to be that person, Okay. So I think
so it becomes this vicious cycle somehow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's just one example. But there's also, I think there's limits on academic freedom when it comes to how research is sort of conducted when it comes to projects, research projects. The projectification of science, which is the idea that you need to apply for funding. And once you get the funding, which doesn't go in your pocket, by the way, it goes to the university and nothing really changes except maybe you can hire an extra staff or two. But you need to appeal to these topics that are sort of in the public consciousness, right? So you're much more likely to win a project today on disinformation or polarization or populism because people have heard of these terms, but actually these terms don't really mean much, I would argue. So you can write a grant to say that you're going to study populist disinformation on social media for 4 years and probably get that money. But there's a tension there between what you truly want to study and what will actually get you the funding, and sort of boxing it into, okay, you need to deliver this in 4 years. To some extent it's necessary, but I think this whole sort of streamlining research into boxes and projects, which comes from the natural sciences, it makes sense there in many ways because you're in a lab. There's experiments that are, time. But when it comes to social science, it's like, well, what if something completely changes and you can't deliver on what you said? There's flexibility for that, but the whole steering of science One more example.
Yeah.
Ethics. Sorry, I'm very passionate about
no,
this.
Excellent.
Topic.
Yeah.
Ethics.
Yeah.
So in Sweden, we have this requirement that we just anything that deals with like social data needs to get ethics approval, and there's reasons for that, right? But what this ethics board doesn't understand is that they assume that people will continue to research what they wanted to research before and just comply with doing the ethics. There's, for example, if you study a group outside of Sweden, it falls outside of the ethic board scope. So if I do an online experiment on American participants, then, so basically involving people who are not Swedes, if I apply to the ethics board, they come back and say, well, you pay your 8,000 crowns or whatever it is, and they say, thank you for applying, but this is outside the scope. But you have to apply anyways. But we're going to tell you it's outside the scope.
And they keep the money.
Of our law. Yeah, exactly. So what they're assuming is that me as a researcher will like continue focusing my research on the Swedish population because that's what I truly want to do. Whereas the incentive for me is to not pay the 8,000 crowns, not spend weeks writing an application, and study Americans instead. So that's steering
But can you do that at a Swedish university, study Americans and... Yeah, you could, right?
Well, it's a gray zone because it's not written into the law. And so no one really knows how it works. But, I mean, if you have a choice, let's take a different example. You have a choice between doing something that involves getting ethics approval and something that doesn't. Your academic freedom is sort of limited there. Or you have an extra variable that comes into it, an extra consideration. Whereas, do I want to spend weeks and then wait months to do this? Especially if you're... a PhD student or someone that needs for working towards being promoted, you need to get publications. Time delay matters. So that's something that interacts with academic freedom as well. It's necessary to an extent, but
But so how do we weight this then? Because it seems to me that I've taken the ethics course just recently, which they made compulsory.
And how much time did that take?
It was two weeks full time, and some of us will never even do experiments. I mean, it was in the humanities. I mean, philosophy and so most of the people in the group have never even run experiments. But for some, it was necessary. And for example, for my small experiment that I was going to do, I skipped it because it's going to take a lot of time, right? Just for the reasons you're saying. But how do you then satisfy this need? It seems like there should be some need to protect the people we're doing the experiments on and the ethics concerning our research. How do we balance that? What's another better solution?
I mean, I think you, to some extent, maybe this is controversial to say, but I think, let's take doctors, right? Doctors are trusted to make decisions based on their judgment. They spend lots of time in school, and they're expected to synthesize data, look at different things, and make a decision based on their judgment. There's cases where academics have had bad judgment in terms of having, Cambridge Analytica, for example, collecting information and leaking it out or selling it, right? But that's a few bad apples. I think in general, researchers have good judgment in terms of when they're harming people or not. And these sorts of laws are necessary to protect the institution and to sort of monitor and sort of make sure that things are ethically compliant. But at the same time, it's sort of a slap in the face of academics' judgment. So let's take collecting social media data, for example, which is what I do. There are risks if, let's say, you collect social media posts, tweets, for example, about people who are against a certain government, right? And that gets in the wrong hands. Then that can be used to identify them, throw them in jail, persecute them, right? So there's a real risk there. But if you're studying conversations around, I don't know, an election, which is normally what I do, what's the worst case scenario? What happens if the Russians get my tweets, which they could collect by themselves, right? Like, what's the worst case scenario of people getting public data? It doesn't make sense, I think, to write an ethics approval that I know they're going to approve. So it's sort of a formality.
But playing devil's advocate there, just for a little bit.
Please do.
So sure, I can see how maybe we can make judgments about immediate threats to an individual or to people. But as we talked about before, it seems like people get offended by, all kinds of things. You can't talk about race or mention class in connection with race, all these kinds of things. So in Sweden, where we're funded by the state, by taxpayer money funding, should we listen to people's concerns when it comes to, I don't know, how we should study gender or how we should study, all these things? Should the ethics in society at large guide academics? Should we have to consider more than maybe what is immediate threat? Or do you understand?
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to what we were talking about before, that's another layer on academic freedom, right?
Yes.
I mean, I definitely think that that there is a responsibility to give back to the taxpayer, and we do that mostly through teaching, I would say. Okay. We're paid to train. We use public money to train future generations in whatever they want to sort of go into, but also research as well. But this, as you know yourself, especially in philosophy, right? Like this is an expensive enterprise, and the payoff is not always clear. But I do think there is a risk that if you take one extreme and you say, let's only research what the public wants and how they want it done, how do we know that that's the best way? Where are the counter arguments to that? And if the counter arguments or looking at another side ends up in, being canceled or disqualified from having the funding to do this, then you're sort of, I think it comes to academic freedom. You're sort of being steered by public will, and maybe there should be, how about a state agency that surveys the public and then does the research that they want done, how they do it, right? But leave some space for creativity and thinking outside the box, right? Yeah. Because I think one thing for media and communication is that the public is often, and just thinking like the public as this broad thing, right? I mean, one of the ways that they primarily become informed is through the media, mainstream media, online media, now what other people are saying on social media. And you have to think about, it's really interesting, the sort of logics or basically how the media works. So we've all heard of disinformation. Yeah. Big problem, right? So says media. Yes. Why are we talking so much about disinformation? Why is the media talking about so much about disinformation? Well, think about journalists. What do? They're in the business of media. Yeah. So they're very interested in disinformation. They report a lot about it. Yeah. Why do journalists talk so much about Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter? Yeah. Because journalists are on Twitter. And so they're interested in this. They're reporting about it. The public thinks, they get these messages that disinformation is changing everyone's opinions. You put some science behind it, it's not that simple. Really? And it's kind of obvious it's not that simple. No one sees information and just automatically changes their mind, right? Yeah. We have just proven this for 100 years, literally. Yeah. So those things are complicated when you say, well, should we do what the public is asking for? Where is the public getting their information? Then is research being steered by journalists more than the public? And who are these journalists? And why should we listen to them? Yeah. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah, very, very interesting. I mean, we've got similar problem. I'm researching conspiracy theory specifically. So I can see that coming again in that, where they're conflating different concepts. And when you actually start looking into it, it's not it's
serious.
Never that simple.
No, it's not. And it's not that simple. But so your research, right? If we talk about your research, one of your publications, I don't remember the full name, but it's about emotions, studying the emotions of politics and social media. Do you remember that paper, the name? I'll put it in the description.
Cross-platform emotions, something like that.
That's exactly, that's the short version. Yeah. So in that study, because I was curious what kind of results you would get with that, or what kind of, because do you help politicians to navigate or to change their advertising so that they target the right groups, or who are you really helping out with this research?
I mean, I think this one was really aimed more at researchers in the sense that when it comes to social media data, and this is changing a bit with different ownership and companies and scandals like Cambridge Analytica, companies like Meta are making access to data much more difficult. But in general, social media offers so much data and so much new data, right? So you could go to Twitter and you could collect 50 million tweets in, I don't know, a few hours. Wow. And so with this data, you can just start swimming in data and just start analyzing stuff. And I think that's really what a lot of research, not just in my field, but in other fields. It's just like, let's just take some social media data and do something with it. And basically being data-driven. Studies being driven by what data is out there. And just like with the journalist example, what you have here, to an extent, is what social media companies are opening up in terms of data, and also in what they're not opening up, is steering what people are researching. So in this study, we were trying to say, like, there is an up-and-coming field of research on images, because if you open up any social media platform, you're going to see images and you're going to see video. And for the past 10 years, everyone's been studying text, comments, posts. But if you look at a platform, it's visual. It's not so much about the text. TikTok, great example, very little text. So there's more of a move to look at these images and videos, and because people are sort of driven by the data, the natural question is, well, what are politicians doing with these images? And so there's a lot of research looking at, what are in these images? Is it the public life is the politician being sort of showing them at their job? Or are they showing them with their family? Interesting, but I don't know what that actually means. What do I do with this information? Like they're public versus private, and one gets more likes than the other. Not very interesting long term.
So it's the likes that you measure because I think you made a connection to how they actually vote as well, or was that?
Didn't go that far.
Oh, you didn't. Okay.
But what we did with the study was basically to say, look, we're not going to look at what's just in these photos and how they correlate with likes. I mean, we're going to do that too. But what we find, we basically classify what emotion the face is, and this is very controversial from psychology. You can't say there's an emotion in the face, but what we ask people is say, what emotion do you think is in the face? And they can code that, and if they agree, we can take it as a label. So we looked at what emotions people thought politicians had or were communicating with their face, and we looked at how those posts performed on Facebook versus Instagram. And we found that, I mean, shocker, no surprise, politicians are mostly happy. They showed themselves as smiling. And this was received well on Instagram, but not on Facebook, compared to a calm face. So if you have just a calm, serious face, Instagram users gave those more likes, Facebook users didn't. And so, like, what do we do with this information? Who cares what performs better on one platform versus the other? What we're arguing there is that what this may signal is that there's a difference in what different ages of people want from their political leaders. So you can think on Facebook, who's the users there today? It's older people. Older people may prefer calm, serious leaders because they like this idea of having leaders who are in control, stable, strong. Like think of just a picture of Trump on Facebook, like, serious face. Whereas on Instagram, younger users who tend to be younger, they may prefer leaders to be more approachable and warm and showing sadness, like compassion, hugging people, this idea of Gen Z being more emotional, right? And so what we're basically arguing at the paper, very long way to say it, is that by using the social media data, maybe we can learn something about society in the sense of what different generations of people think or prefer in political leaders, not what is the campaign doing by communicating happiness or sadness. So it's trying to get a little bit beyond just, what can this data actually tell us or signal that can be followed up?
And then, so did you, going back to the ethics question, I can see something in this where it would have taken a long time to get ethics approval if you were to do it the old standard way of researching. And so then what would happen if, but do you see problems? But I see problems with that as well. So like, for example, Facebook and Instagram and stuff like that, I don't have a real name there. I don't even have my real age and stuff like that. So how, if you wanted to like really not just making an argument about age, but to actually look into it, how would you do that? How would you?
You can't really.
You can't.
And so we didn't look at any users in particular. We just looked at the general like count. Right. You could, I mean, theoretically, I guess you could ask people on the platform, right? But and that's one of the problems is that a lot of this data is you sort of have to make guesses. Like you can sort of predict people's gender by taking their name and running it through and say, okay, Karen's more likely to be female and John's more likely to be male. But who's to say these users are using their real name?
Okay, I see. But so then, because what I hear you saying is that then you're making some kind of, understanding of how our democracy looks, or the voters at least, of what they're looking for in the politicians.
That's the argument we make.
You're making that, yeah.
But the point is, and it's funny, you mentioned winning this thing of presenting your research in 4 minutes. I'm probably going way over that now. But just to move beyond being trapped by, here's some data and here's what I can say about the public versus private. Trying to think, because at least we can't prove in our study whether it's this old and young dynamic and what people think about political leaders, but you could design an experiment that tests that in the future.
And
so are we getting a signal, right? And so I think that's important, that any research study is not sort of self-contained, right? It's borrowing from prior knowledge and it's setting up for future tests.
So it's the whole method and the thinking around what to do with this data and
the whole process of science. Big S.
Yes.
Big S.
Exactly. So quickly, just going back to Twitter and how we should promote our research, and like you mentioned, even Elon Musk taking over, and it's been a trend now that academics are leaving Twitter as a statement to they don't agree with the ethical standard that Twitter has right now, How do you see that for us academics, like when we're trying to do public outreach? How much concern should we put into that? Or should we just agree to wherever we're invited? And is there,
how'd that migration to Mastodon work out? Right? I don't know. It's very strange. I mean, let's just take the Twitter example. Elon Musk. I mean, I don't know. I mean, he's obviously a character, right? And I don't particularly like the guy. I don't know him, though, right? But I don't know where his buying of Twitter became so evil in some sense. Because if you think about it, I mean, compared to you or me, who has done more for climate change? Me, you, or Elon Musk by creating an electric vehicle? Thousands of them on the road. Yeah. So it's like, I don't get that.
Sure, but isn't that an argument about still trying to consider who he is, right? So you're just weighing better qualities that Elon Musk has. So it's still somehow evaluating him running the platform. So we should be engaged in that. Is that how we should make our judgment on what we contribute to and where we spread, or who we show up and speak for, or if you're invited to a YouTube channel, do you think like, they're a good person?
You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. I think that was Michael Jordan. But no, I think the strategy of sort of removing content that you disagree with is not a good strategy in any context. Exactly. You look at terrorists, for example. There's research on terrorists, ISIS terrorists, where when you block them, they're more likely to actually go out and kill people because you're constraining their voice. And I think coming from political science theories, I mean, for a long time the idea was that democracy should be judged by only how many people vote, how engaged they are in local organizations, these actions, these physical actions. But there's been a movement since the 2000s to say that basically conversation is really, it's what happens in between elections that matters, right? And so I think academics should be everywhere they can. Where's the best place to sort of counter misinformation on people who are spreading misinformation, these YouTube channels? And then YouTube coming in and sort of putting a strike and closing down a channel because they claim it's misinformation. I mean, it's their right. These are private companies.
Yes, so it's a different...
And that's an important thing, I think, in this debate is that, at least when it comes to American law, we think about free speech. It's not just that free speech applies to individuals, it also applies to companies, right? Newspapers aren't required to publish your op-ed. Twitter isn't required to publish your tweet.
No, that's right.
And it can also shut it down if it wants, or retract a news article if you're a publication. So that's just to say that these are tricky questions about ownership and how academics navigate it. I mean, it's up to them. If they don't want to be associated with something, obviously don't go on it. But I think the best way to deal with some of these controversies is just to discuss them.
Yes.
And let people make up their own minds,
Totally agree with you, Jonatan. And I think if I'm hearing you correctly, like to keep it, we say in Swedish, högt i tak. So like keep it high to the ceiling and keep conversation open and not put the stigma on each other. Like how you were giving the example about the conference you went to, for example. So because that's something that even I'm feeling, and I'm pretty new in academia, and I can feel already that people ignore certain topics. They don't want to talk about it or even discuss it if it's sort of given what opinion you already should have on it. And that I feel is a shame when it even affects academia. Do you think that social media is contributing to that? Like we said, polarization is not a real thing, but people are talking about how social media is making us be able to create our own little culture groups where we get an echo chamber and confirm our own views. Or is it not really how it works?
I mean, you'll always find echo chambers if you go look for them.
Okay.
But the idea that someone can live in an echo chamber, you know, you may have one on Twitter or you may have one on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, but you just can't go through life avoiding anything you disagree with. So the whole, it I don't know, to me it's a bit fuzzy.
Yeah, for sure.
But what was the question again? I forget.
Because you study social media, so I was just wondering if like do you see polarization there, or is it just as it would be at any other place where if you're not open to new ideas and you don't want to discuss, then you don't. But most of the time we get exposed to each other.
Yeah, no, it's tough. I mean, I think one of this may be a little sideways to answering your question a bit, but I mean, one of the things with social media is that I think we sort of have this idea that like we open up our phones and we have access to all this information.
Yeah.
To an extent we do if we search it through Google or something. But if you think about it, there's so much more data, social media posts that are being generated. They can't fit all on our phone. If we were scrolling to see everything that was posted today by everyone, we wouldn't finish before we die, right? Yeah. So there is this like moderation element too that I think is important in the sense that even if you're out having conversations, it's hard for people to find them sometimes. And what I think we can say about social media, getting as close to sort of ground truth as we can in the social sciences, is that it's this loud vocal minority that gets amplified.
Okay.
And so if you see this, you know, terrible stuff on Twitter and it's just all you see, or if you're seeing these extreme voices, and there's a risk that you perceive that this is what the majority of the population thinks. And over again, we can see that people, take polarization, for example. People will always think that someone who has a different view than them, they'll overestimate to what extent that person thinks it. It's actually called false polarization. So people think society is so polarized based on what they see and what they read, especially on social media. But when it comes to actually like measuring people's attitudes on things, people are more moderate than you think. And it makes sense. If you think about the sort of world around you and your interactions in the city you live or the town you live, people are generally getting along okay, right? They're not trying to kill each other. They're not as polarized as you might read online or see these extreme voices. So it's a small group of really highly active, vocal people that take up most of the conversation and contribute to the idea that things are worse than they are.
Yeah. Is this true in the States as well, or is it the same here in Sweden? It's the same, yeah. Okay.
I think so.
All right.
I think so.
Because that's again, I think another thing maybe that we amplify here, how polarized it is in the United States, because that's what we hear from the media. So and we don't actually live in that society.
This is really interesting for me as an American, because Donald Trump gets elected, right?
Yeah.
And it was everything was falling apart. And to an extent it was, a little bit. But I was living over here and I was going on a research day to university in the States for 6 months. And I was nervous. I was like, wow, like, is it going to be people really that bad? Ended up going. People are cool. They get along. Americans are fake nice, right? Like, and it works. It works in some weird way. And I was just like, wow, if you never actually go and visit the place and you're just reading about how everything is falling apart and you're getting quotes from people who are just beating this drum of, everything is broken and everyone's persecuted and everyone's struggling. I mean, there definitely are real struggles. But at the same time, I think the sort of general sense is that people are happy in sort of world's, sort of strongest economy. It sort of makes sense in a way. And so I think there is this interesting mediation, right, of how things are, where controversy, it attracts our attention, we know that, and it gets amplified more. So you're going to see it more, but pull out of your phone a bit and look around, and you'll see that things are actually quite good. We're living in a time, by the way, where we have the most technological advancement ever. People are, on the whole, better off than at any point in history, and of course there's exceptions to that. But we live in good times, and I think we forget that when we only read sensationalist media, for example.
Yeah, definitely. And so an important role of the academic then is to communicate this, right? That maybe the situation doesn't look the way that maybe it's perceived on social media or journalists.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think one argument is that academics need to get out with their research to counter all the fake news that's out there. Right?
Yes, exactly.
And I think also we have a responsibility to counter the mainstream news as well, because that often is simplifying, and you have to think about journalists. And I don't have anything against journalists, right? But they are under pressure to sell things. They do need to bring revenues to their struggling business models. And in that sense, they have an incentive to, it's not as serious as clickbait, right? They're not putting out fake headlines, but they are putting out catchy headlines. Think about the Daily Mail or the Sun or some of these tabloids, Aftonbladet, for example. Think about those. Think about why a story is presented in the way that it is. And then think, does that match with what you actually experience? And I think that gets you a long way. So I think academics actually have a responsibility to go out and say, no, it's not that simple. It's not that bad. Or maybe it is that bad based on our research.
Exactly. Yeah. Depending on what we find or how we evaluate the situation, right? That we're researching. Yeah, so definitely maybe it's something that academics should practice a bit more too. I mean, not everybody's as skilled as you are in communicating it. Or should they still go out there anyway? Or how does it work?
I think there's definitely there's a personality component, right? If you're an introvert, it's harder.
Yeah.
But what I was really interested in is, we have these every field has its big conference, political science conference, communication conference, philosophy conference, whatever. We had our International Communication Association conference sort of right after COVID was all the lockdowns were starting. And I was like, okay, here we have, 2,000 communication experts researching communication. Let's see how their virtual presentations look. Right? And it was just as you'd expect, flipped up laptop. And it's just, people just don't think to do it. And you would think that communication experts would be really on point with getting their communication, but they're not. And I think academics, on the one hand, it's because there's so much other stuff that we have to do. But I think, again, coming from saying everything is communication, it really is important if you want to be understood. Otherwise, if it's not important for your message to be understood, then if you spend so much time focusing on the specifics of your research, and then you're not spending time thinking about how do you actually communicate this effectively, then that research, for whatever audience you're trying to communicate it to, it's like, I don't know, you're the philosopher. If a tree falls in the middle of the woods and no one sees it or hears it, does it fall?
Does it fall? Yeah,
exactly. It's the same thing with research, I think. If people actually don't get your message, they don't understand it, then what's the point?
Very, very important point to remember, I think. Thank you so much, Michael, for clarifying all this. I think we've got so much to think about there, about, just how we should communicate our research. I guess it's a very important task for academics. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks so much for having me.